Hey, hi there. This session is going to look at laboratory and field experiments, and it's the first research method found in your red sociology book. You'll be assessed on this in paper 1 and paper 3, a 10 marker on paper 1 and a 10 and a 20 on paper 3. Remember though that it could also come up as one of your methods in context. So that's the 20 marker on paper 1. Let's go. So we're going to focus on, first of all, on lab experiments, laboratory experiments, and you're going to think immediately of this kind of image. This woman here is working in a scientific laboratory. She could be working on medicines, for example. We are not thinking of that. Okay, we are doing sociology, and we are not thinking about a laboratory experiment in terms of chemicals, test tubes, petri dishes, microscopes, nothing like that. Instead, what we're going to focus on is a type of research. And a lab experiment is a type of social research in sociology that starts with an independent variable. An independent variable is not actually language you need. You need it for psychology A-level, but you don't actually need it for sociology A-level, but it helps you to understand, so I'm going to briefly go through it. The independent variable is the thing that you manipulate or that you change. So if you're measuring whether salted water or regular water makes plants grow better, the only thing that you change is your independent variable. That's the type of water that you use. You would not give a plant, the two plants that you were testing, different pot sizes. You wouldn't use two different types of plants, and you wouldn't put them one in the light and one in the dark. You would try and keep everything the same apart from the type of water. And the thing that you are changing, the type of water, is the independent variable. What you then do in your experiment, your lab experiment, is you control all the other variables. And I really mean you try to control all of them. In sociology, this means you try and do it at the same time of day. You do it with the same number of participants. You ask exactly the same questions. You try and make the temperature in the room exactly the same. You try and do it at the same time of in the year, the same season, because potentially whether it's cold or hot outside might change people's behaviour. So you try and control all other variables. What you then end up with is a measurement. You end up with your dependent variable. Now this is the change, if you like. You are measuring the impact of the change to that independent variable. So our control, our no experiment done, our regular would be the plant with regular water. Our independent variable is our water that we have changed. And our dependent variable would be the amount of growth in that experimental condition. So the salted water would reduce the plant growth. It would be less healthy for the plant. And so the plant would grow less. And that's our dependent variable, the reduced growth in the plant. Okay, so this all sounds very sort of strange in sociological terms, and it is really. And one of the reasons is that we don't do this method very much. It's the least popular method. It's very rare to do it in sociology, as you'll see, because there are loads of disadvantages. So, highly controlled study of the effect of one variable, one particular variable. Harvey and Slattin have got a good example here of a lab experiment conducted in the education system. You've got 96 teachers shown 18 photos of children each. So each teacher is shown 18 photos from different class backgrounds. So they're showing some children that are working class, some children that are middle class. The teachers then rate them in terms of parental attitude and performance. So what we're changing here, the independent variable, is the photos of the children and the class that they come from. So those two things tied together. And what you are then going to measure is how the teachers respond to them. So the dependent variable is how the teachers actually respond to them. And what we find was that the lower class children were rated less favourably. The teachers predicted that their parents would have a less favourable attitude to school. They predicted that the working class students would perform less well. And this was a very controlled lab experiment. You'll note it wasn't done in a lab per se. This is done in any room. You can do a lab experiment in a classroom, you could do it at a university room. It doesn't really matter as long as you can control all of the other variables. Most of the time, lab experiments tend to be conducted in universities because the researcher can control the environment effectively. Stanley Milgram is a good example of somebody that conducted a lab experiment in his campus where he was working at his university. And he conducted a very famous study that psychologists learn about, but it also has relevance for sociology, into obedience. And he effectively asked the participant to give shocks to someone for getting answers wrong in a quiz. The participant didn't realise that they weren't giving real shocks. And what they found is by just telling this person to keep giving shocks, they could persuade 65% of people to not just kill someone next door, but to fry their dead body consistently. And this was, again, a controlled lab experiment, everything controlled, everything the same each time, same machine, same prompts, same person in a lab coat, and the same setup. And what you're testing here was the level of obedience. That's your dependent variable that you end up with. This is slightly unusual in that the independent variable, the thing that you're manipulating, is the participant themselves. It's their actual behaviour. Okay, so what are the practical strengths of using lab experiments? Well, there's no need to train a team of interviewers, which is cheap and quick. Milgram could just get started straight away, really, just had to don a lab coat or get one person to don a lab coat and read out a script. So it can often be quite cheap and quick. You don't need to be really personable. So this isn't like a participant observation where you need to be really good with people. You need to be able to, even trick them if it's covert. It's not like that at all. You don't need to be interpersonal, and that's a good practical advantage. Attractive to funding bodies due to scientific nature. What we mean here is that governments really like positivist, quantitative research. There is a bias in government towards science. Science is seen as the best way of doing public policy because the public generally see science as very authoritative. And if they can say, we're doing this policy because science tells us to, then it's deemed that the public will accept it more. So therefore, a lab experiment is quite likely to gain funding, particularly from the government, because they'll be able to say, well, this research was actually conducted using scientific methods. Practical disadvantages. Well, you can't control variables in the past. We cannot go back and do a lab experiment on the suffragettes or on the civil rights movement. We just can't do it. Whereas with documents, you could go back and read letters and read newspaper articles. Macro theories cannot be studied in a lab, so you can't put the suffragettes or you can't put sexism rather into a laboratory and test it. You can't put class conflict into a laboratory and test it. You might be able to test some sexist attitudes to a certain thing, but you can't take a macro theory, a large theory, and study it in a laboratory. You can take a macro theory and study it if you are looking at a large range of documents or if you're looking at a large range of official statistics, but not in a lab experiment with a very tiny sample size with one specific situation. You're just not going to be able to do it. And it is very difficult to get a large sample. Now, Milgram performed one of the most famous lab experiments in history, and it has been replicated hundreds of times all over the world. But the sample size of all of Milgram's replications, so every time anyone has done a Milgram study all over the world, you can get a larger sample size yourself by doing an email questionnaire. You could send out an emailed questionnaire and get enough responses back that there would be more people who had done your study than have ever done a Milgram study. And Milgram did this study in the 60s. So you can see there that the sample sizes you can get with lab experiments are really quite small. They're always going to end up being small. Particular lab experiments tend to have a sample size of around 10. So, 10 at a time. Okay, ethical. There are no ethical advantages. Lab experiments have big problems here. So there's usually a lack of informed consent. So in order to have a lab experiment, you generally don't tell people what they're doing and why they're doing it. So you want to try and reduce the Hawthorne effect as much as you can, and that's when people change their behaviour because they know they're being watched. So you try not to tell the participant why they're being studied. In Milgram's example, you couldn't say, oh, by the way, the person next door isn't really there, and those shocks, they aren't really real electricity, because then the entire study would be a waste of time. So what you need to do is actually trick people when you're doing lab experiments, and that means you haven't got informed consent. Informed consent is when you tell people what they're about to go through and they agree. Harm. Well, Milgram's study did cause psychological harm. Some people, were physically shaking. Some of them cried. Some of them were laughing hysterically. They believed that they were murdering somebody. And it's unethical to cause this kind of psychological harm. They were deceived. They were tricked. They were lied to. And they didn't have their free will. They weren't able to make decisions for themselves. There was someone in a lab coat telling them, move up to the next level, move up to the next level, keep on shocking them. This wasn't watching people in their natural environment behaving in a free and open way. This was people being put into Milgram's situation and being pushed and pressed to do things. So again, they were deceived and they had their free will taken away. Lab experiments are the worst method for ethical problems in the whole of sociology, and that is why they are almost never conducted in sociology. Reliability. They are highly standardized. Every single step is laid out, and so it is very easy, therefore, to replicate, for other researchers to repeat. As I said to you, Milgram's study has been replicated hundreds of times. Negativity, there's none. They are very, very standardized. There are positivists enjoy this because you can literally follow them through every single step and gain good reliability. Validity. Now, the researcher is detached. The researcher often isn't in the room, and therefore their biases don't come into play, which actually helps make the results more objective. It means you get less researcher effect. In an interview or in participant observation, the researcher's biases end up affecting the validity of the data. Here, the researcher often isn't even there. They are detached from the study. They are separate to the study. However, big problems with validity. The Hawthorne effect. So you can't eliminate the Hawthorne effect here because people know that they're being watched. They know that they're in a study, and when you know that that is happening, you change your behaviour. Maybe you try to behave better than you normally would. Maybe you try to behave worse than you normally would. It depends on who you are, but you know that you are being studied, and so you don't behave naturally. If you're not behaving naturally, you're not behaving normally. And remember, validity is about discovering true human behaviour. So if people aren't behaving normally, that's not true human behaviour. It's a really artificial environment, so as I said, it's not scientific labs, but it can be a university in a strange room that you've never been to before, and it's not your normal life. If it's not your normal life, you don't behave normally. The data that is gathered is limited. So I just told you that you'll have a sample size, 10 people, 12 people maybe, and so that's not a lot of data at all. You get more from a questionnaire of some year 7 students that you could write yourself. The data is quantitative. So you're going to get numerical data at the end of it. This percentage of people did this. This percentage of people went to this number of volts. That was Milgram's data that he got at the end. Very simple, very superficial data. Doesn't tell us why they went that far. Doesn't tell us whether they would go that far in different situations. It doesn't tell us whether they would go that far in normal real life. And so the validity of it is reduced. Representativeness. You can... Because it's a lab experiment, you can select your sample group really specifically. So if you want to study men between the ages of 40 and 41, you can, because you can select that sample perfectly. It's much harder to do that with things like documents, where you just have to go with the documents that are in front of you. And so here, selecting the right sample group can be really, really easy. However, it's an artificial environment. So the idea that your sample group is going to represent real behaviour out in the real world, again, doesn't pass scrutiny. But most importantly is the small sample sizes. So if you've got a small sample size, what that means is the likelihood of that sample representing wider society goes down. If you speak to one year 7 student and you speak to 50 year 7 students, the group of 50 will give you a better idea of what everyone else in year 7 believes. If you speak to just one, you'll get a very bad idea. The best example of this is school tours. If people want to understand what a school is like, don't believe what you hear from the student that is asked to walk you around. Because the student that is asked to walk you around is a student that likes the school and will say something positive about it. If you want to really know what people think of the school, speak to lots of people, get a large sample size. Is this a positivist or interpretivist method? Well, it's strongly positivist, as you may have guessed. Quantitative data, highly reliable, highly standardized. Very strict control of behaviour would mean that interpretivists are not interested. Interpretivism is voluntaristic. They want to study human beings as free thinking, conscious individuals, social actors, and so they're not interested in this highly controlled way of looking at society. And just to remind you here, even though we're saying it's a positivist method, positivists don't really use lab experiments either, because they're just rubbish for studying large-scale things in sociology, and they're really unethical. Field experiments. So these are our second type of experiment that you can get asked about. This has been asked about in an exam before. They are all of the stuff we talked about before with independent variable, that all counts the same as well. Independent variable, dependent variable, what we're measuring, try and control everything else. The difference between a field experiment and a lab experiment, well, there are two. First difference takes place in natural surroundings. So a field experiment takes place in the field. In the field means where people naturally live. So a field experiment of a school or in a school would be in a school. A field experiment of the police would be following police officers around or in a police station or in the streets where the police are acting. So a field experiment is in natural surroundings, not artificial. And secondly, in field experiments, nearly always your subjects, your participants, are not aware that they're actually in an experiment. So that's a really, really important big difference that's going to get rid of our Hawthorne effect. Bystander effect, right? This is a classic example of a sociological field experiment. What you do is you take somebody, lie them down on the floor, they pretend to be ill or sick or dead, and you wait to see how long it takes until someone stops to try and help. And you can YouTube this, just stick into YouTube, bystander effect. There are loads of different videos of it, and it takes ages. Generally speaking, as I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised, it takes a long time until people stop to help people. And, they're more likely to stop and help someone who's in a suit. They're more likely to stop and help people at certain times of day. This is an experiment because we're trying to control our variables. We're using somebody who's lying on the floor. We're using somebody who's pretending to have these symptoms consistently. But we are doing it in the real world. So we obviously have to let loose some of our other variables. We have to let loose with things like time of day, temperature outside. We have to be a little bit looser with which people are walking past. We can't control that because we're in the real world. The second type of field experiment, well, another example of a field experiment is Rosenhan's famous pseudo patient experiment. Pseudo means fake, so it was a fake patient experiment. What did Rosenhan do? Well, him and his researchers, they went to 12 mental hospitals. So him and his researchers, they all went to different mental hospitals. And they said that they'd been hearing voices in their head. And I think they said that the voices said empty, dull, thud. They all said the same thing, again, trying to control those variables. They were admitted to these hospitals because saying that you're hearing voices is a classic symptom of schizophrenia. Once they were admitted into hospital, they all agreed that they would then start behaving normally, and they would say that they no longer heard any voices. What they found was that they were all treated as if they were mentally ill. The doctors and the nurses spoke to them as if they were mentally ill. Remember, they were not mentally ill. They had only faked it. If the mental hospitals were working normally, or if they were working properly, they would have tested them again and they'd have said, oh, right, you no longer have any symptoms. You are no longer mentally ill. Leave the hospital. But what they found is they were kept for weeks and weeks and weeks, often with no visitors, for hours and hours and hours a day. And eventually they were released with a diagnosis. They all had a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. So even then they were still labelled as schizophrenic. So this is a good example of you haven't got into a lab here and taken doctors and nurses and put them into an artificial lab. They've gone to real hospitals. but they're still trying to control the variables by having consistent behaviour. So they're all behaving in a consistent way, and then writing up their conclusions. So practical. Well, you can observe behaviour in lots of different settings. So I just showed you we're doing a field experiment on the street, or you can go into a mental institution and do a field experiment there. So you can now open it up. You don't have to stick to what you can do in a lab. You can set up a field experiment and let it run for a year and come back later. So you can set these kind of Rosenhan style experiments that can last for weeks and weeks, maybe even months. And so that, again, is a practical benefit of being able to see changes over time. It would be much harder to do that in a laboratory. I mean, you just wouldn't practically be able to do it because, you can't just put people in a room for weeks and weeks and weeks. Practical disadvantages, well, it's very difficult to record data accurately because there are too many things happening at once. So when you're watching the bystander effect, are you watching everyone that's walking past? Are you watching the reactions of everyone as they walk past? Are you only measuring people that stop? In that sense, you're missing lots of data because it's too hard to see all of that at the same time. That's why you try and film it. Rosenhan, they had to write notes to themselves to try and gather down all of their data, but did they remember everything? It's really difficult to record data when you're in the natural world. Obviously much harder, much easier in a lab experiment because it's all in one room, you can just film it and see everything that's happening at once. It's hard to control the variables. So if you're doing this bystander effect, what happens if a paramedic walks past first and the paramedic just sees someone lying on the floor and they just stop? Well, that's going to skew your data, isn't it? It's really hard to control the variables. Ideally, what you'd want is to be able to guarantee that everyone walking past the person on the ground was an average sample of everyone that would normally walk past the person on the ground. But obviously, you can't do that in the real world. You can't study the past still. Same problem. We can't go back in time and do field experiments. And it's obviously the same as lab experiments. We can't study macro theories either. We can't put the class system into a field experiment. Ethical advantages, there are none. Ethical disadvantages, lack of informed consent, obviously, we're tricking people. You could be in a field experiment and you don't even know it. You're only told about it afterwards. Again, that's not informed consent. It could lead to psychological harm. So as far as we know, the bystander effect hasn't caused any psychological harm, but it could do. Seeing someone who you believe to be dead might cause people to become distressed. Again, you're sort of removing people's free will there. People want to go and act the way they would normally act. In participant observation, you give people just the freedom to behave as they normally would. Here, we're sort of tricking people again, and so we're taking away their free will. Reliability. Well, as you've seen, we can control some of the variables. So Rosenhan could control people presenting at hospitals, people claiming which symptoms they had, then saying they didn't have the symptoms. But there were loads of variables they couldn't control. They couldn't control which nurses they had, which doctors they had, what type of hospital it was, the time of day when they had their conversations. All of these things couldn't be controlled, but they could control some of them, and so it was partially standardized. It is hard, though, as I just said, to standardize it fully, because it's more difficult to replicate the exact context of the research again. So changing variables like weather, time of year, the people present, they always shift and move. In a lab, you can get those under control, whereas out on the street, out in the natural world, you can't. Validity. So real life settings, behaviour more natural, that's fairly obvious. There's no Hawthorne effect here because people don't even know they're being watched at all, so they're going to behave fully naturally. However, as we said before, you can't actually observe everything that happens, and so you might miss those vital details. And you tend to only measure what people do and not why they do it. So we can say people will stop and help a bystander who is pretending to be ill on average after 15 minutes. But that doesn't tell us why, and surely that's more interesting. And that's where a qualitative method may come into its own. Representativeness, well, it's more likely to represent real behaviour because it's a natural setting, but it's low representativeness, sorry, that should be a red cross, low representativeness as you cannot observe a large sample at any one time, and the event can only happen once as well. Is it positivist or interpretivist? Well, field experiments are still probably positivist. Again, they're not super popular. They're a bit more towards the interpretivist side because they have a bit more validity. They are used more in psychology than in sociology. Generally tend to produce quantitative data again, although they can, like Rosenhan, also supplement that with qualitative. Okay, exam questions, paper 1 or paper 3. Outline and explain 2 advantages of using lab experiments in sociological research. You can obviously just replace lab with field. You can replace advantages with disadvantages. So as you see there, you can just simply exchange for those two words. And then the 20 marker, evaluate the use of different types of experiments in sociological research. Here you just want to talk through all of the different advantages and disadvantages of both of those methods that we'd looked at. Okay, I hope that was helpful.